My interest is more on what factors affect the individual players. So archival research that examines, I don't know, accrual quality or earnings management, looking at accruals, the financial statements is a joint effect of the auditor's decisions and management. And so I know those of you who studied accounting and understand that the auditors provide assurance about the financial statements. Well, that's just it. They provide assurance as management's financial statements, but there are elements in those financial statements that are not black and white and that do involve discussions, obviously, or what I like to call negotiations between auditors and managers to arrive at what they believe the right number should be. And so I'm really interested in the black box more than I am in the outcome. What drives that outcome and what factors impact that outcome. And so experimental behavioral research is the tool that I choose to look at to do that. So the papers that I assigned are papers that I think gives you gives you some of a flavor for some of traditional audit behavioral research, like some things that are a little bit different. I think Andrea mentioned that she's going to discuss the Biggs and Mock paper, which uses a verbal protocol, which is a really unique way of trying to get at the cognitive process that auditors in this situation with internal controls go through to try to see how they're arriving at their decisions, because we don't understand that. Yes?
Usually, how long does it take to conduct one behavioral experiment?
Forever. It does. It's a long and the problem is because you can't go back, right? So you have to be your upfront investment is very high, right? Because you have to spend, and especially the research that I do examines auditor-client negotiations, and so I'm dealing with partners and managers, and they, first of all, they don't want to do it, but their time is valuable. There's no benefit to them, right? So the most times that they're doing it is because it's a relationship that they have with you or a relationship that they have with the school. So they understand the importance of research. And so this is what makes the research that we're doing in the CAR lab so unique and interesting, because this is something that firms are really interested in. They're less interested in how auditors negotiate. They're less interested in me telling them that you guys really are not getting it right. And they don't want to hear it. But the things that we're doing in the CAR lab with data analytics and continuous auditing and monitoring is something that they see from a business perspective really helps them. And so, which is why I'm slowly moving over to that side, still doing behavioral research, but I feel like I could, it's something that firms are way more interested in. And it will allow us to the CAR lab and the students working in that area to do a lot more interesting behavioral research on, issues related to data analytics and big data. But it does take a long time, because first you have to develop your experiment, right? You're based on what your research question is and what your interest is. A lot of behavioral research is grounded in psych theory, but you have behavioral economics, grounded in, when I was in my doctoral program, we had to take, one of our seminars was experimental economics. And so we looked at, experiments using economic theory, game theory, yes.
You mentioned the economics, behavior economics. One famous branch of behavior economics is some experiment based on game theory.
Right.
But I cannot find a lot of literature about the experiment based on game theory, because I have
about
game theory based experiment, like a game, and you observe the behavior based on the game, something like that.
There's a lot of research on game theory. Are you saying that? Because really, if you think about it, right, game theory, if you have, so with experience, you have people involved.
Yeah.
Right, you're going to have human subjects involved, and you're in game theory. They're making decisions, and you're observing those decisions.
You mean in auditor literature?
Yeah, there is game theory.
Okay.
Research and audit literature. It usually falls under experimental economics. it's not a huge literature, but definitely there's literature out there using game theory.
I only can find a little bit, few papers. Could you provide some list?
I could. Well, what you should do. Okay, I'm trying to think. Who did some work on that. I think one of my former committee members, Elame Matsumura, might have some stuff in that. But I have seen papers. I can't think of any off the top of my head because I just don't do game theory. Jeff Sprinkle, I thought. I think he's at Indiana still, but I'm not sure. I think he did some game theory work using auditors, but there's not a lot. Admittedly, there's not a lot using auditors. But what you find too is that they're not you probably have them using students and the way that they set it up, right? But that's how a lot of experimental economic studies are done. They're using students, and so they're proxying the audit setting, right? So it won't be you issued financial statements. You're going to say there's an asset. Here's what the manager said the asset. You're acting as a verifier. They won't use the term auditor. Yeah. So they try to simulate the market, right? Yeah. And so that's why you'll see that there's audit research using game theory, but not necessarily using auditors. Right?
Are you interested in that kind of paper?
What, using auditors?
I mean, are you interested in that kind of paper?
I like reading it until I get to the mathematical stuff, right? The models. Like I think it's interesting. The reason, so here's the thing, and back to the earlier question, and it ties into your question also, why there are auditors. You have to ask yourself, is this because auditors are very hard to get, obviously. CFOs are hard to get. I have a paper that's coming out in auditing where we got CFOs, and we were really lucky to get controller CFO types because they're just very difficult to get. So you have to ask yourself, is this a question that I have to have auditors in order to answer this question? And because you can, in game theory, you could set it up to simulate an audit environment, and you have to make the case why auditors might behave different in that market, right? And I'm not saying that again, it's going to be dependent on your question, right? If it's a simple matter of trust, why is there any reason to believe auditors' level of trust is different from that? Because we all have some ingrained, in us, our capacity to trust or how much we're willing to trust, right? And then the context might change, but we're not going to move so much. Like if we're skeptical, we're skeptical. The context might increase our skepticism, right? So the question really has to drive whether or not when you think about your question, can I answer question with a proxy for auditors, or do I need auditors to answer this question? So for me, when not into experimental economics, but in my negotiation research, I had to use partners and managers because it was the task, right? It's not a task, not that you can't negotiate, or all of us, we go to buy a car, we negotiate, right? But the context is so different for auditing. And it's only something that partners and managers engage in at that level. So, and some would argue only partners. So I needed to have that level of expertise and experience to answer my question. So that's why it takes a long time, because your recruitment of subjects, and one thing you'll notice with experimental research is you don't have huge samples, right? The number of people that you're getting just, at a minimum, depending on the number of cells, you want to have 20 people per cell, and you're happy to get that, right? So that's another challenge with auditors. Now some of but that's not to discourage, like the profession recognizes, the audit firms recognize, the regulators recognize that we need research. Because we need a better understanding of the elements or factors that impact what makes good judgment right? And you can't just look at the psych literature, because you use the psych literature as a base to develop your theory, but you have to think about it in the context of auditors and how might they make decisions differently. Because there's you can't take a psych student's performing an experiment and say that auditors are going to act the same way. The incentives are different. The risks are different. Right? So you have to think about, so people recognize that it's important to have research in this end, so that's why you have the CAQ. And I know we had some students that came in on the joint program that the AICPA had with the firms, where they recognize that we need to get people who are doing research in audit, tax, that because we have just don't have a lot of people doing research in those areas because of the difficulty of getting published. They recognize the need for that. And you have the Center for Audit Quality, which will do a call for research, and they'll sponsor research. So if your proposal is accepted, they'll give you participants. And what they're trying to do, because they recognize that it's difficult for tenure track assistant professors and PhD students to try to get their research, jump started. For that call, you have to be a junior faculty or a PhD student. Now, a senior person can be on the proposal, but it has to have a staff, a PhD student or a tenure track faculty for the proposal to be accepted. So that's one way that they're trying to get research started.
How often can you submit your proposal to the CAQ?
Anytime they have a call. Well, once it's rejected, you're not going to, the likelihood is it's not going to be, if you can submit a different proposal.
Right.
Now, if you submit it and then you get feedback and you come back with a much improved proposal, I don't think they have anything that prevents you from submitting it again. But it's a very difficult process. Personally, I feel like it's going through a journal review in terms of the proposal, because on the committee, it's academics, a representative from practice, and probably a representative from the CAQ, and they look at your proposal, and they get hundreds of proposals, because the real challenge for people doing audit behavioral research is access to participants. And so you can imagine they're getting hundreds of proposals, and I think they might accept 3 or 4 each year. But that comes with some issues as well. The best way for me, in terms of getting my subjects, is just developing relationships and going, like when I was a PhD student, my dissertation was a behavioral dissertation, auditor-client negotiations, and so I had to get partners and managers to sit down, and I actually had them go through an experiment where I programmed, well, I didn't do it, but I paid somebody to program the computer, to write a program where they would actually feel as though they're interacting with a simulated client. So it gave, with if, ands, and all this other good stuff, and gave them feedback, and I had them go through 10 rounds of a negotiation, or as long as, they could only go 10 rounds. It could be shorter, but it stopped at 10 rounds. And I needed partners and managers, and so I used I was a PhD project alum. I called the KPMG and said, please, I need to graduate. This looks good for you, because I'll finish. You can cap me, but I need your help, right? And they did that. I got some, and then my chair, I went to the chair of my department and said, could you make an appeal to the advisory board? I really need these subjects. You guys want to get me out of here. You need my cubicle, help me. And that's what I had to do. And so I went and I talked to people, and that's how, and so it is. I mean, it's a time-consuming process. And you have to be really careful, because I had a firm, which I will not name, agree to give us access to participants. And in this case, we needed seniors or managers. We didn't even need partners. And they delayed it, kept going at them, and then finally they sent it to us. And when I got the results back, the surveys back, I had one of the students was kind enough, PhD student was kind enough to help me out, and input it into my statistical program. And she said, you know, I was going through it, and I'm like, this doesn't seem right? I mean, the results were great. I was like, wow, I'm like, but something's not right here. You know, that was my auditor intuition. And I'm like, something's not right. And so I contacted her, and I said, could you drop off the actual, because we had hard copies. So I was like, could you drop off the hard copies of the instrument for me? I want to look at them. And when she dropped them off, she says, I meant to tell you that something didn't seem right. So she confirmed what I saw when I looked at the data for this firm. And she confirmed, she's like, something didn't look right. Some of the answers were identical. I said, no, the majority of the answers were identical. So when I looked at the instruments, I noticed that everyone had the same answer. You could tell they just copied it. So what that led me to believe was that the firm just had, for each condition, because we had 4 conditions, and for each condition, they answered it one way, and then just copied it. We asked them for 48, we asked them for 12 per condition, and that's what they gave us. And so it was the same answer. You know, and that's nothing we did. I mean, you know, it's just that it didn't look right to me when I was, because that's part of being, for me, I'm an auditor. When I get numbers and data, I scan it. I, you know, look at patterns. I look at, like, you know, so that was my audit. I had my auditor hat on. And that helps me doing audit research, but the data didn't look right to me. And that's the first time I had ever encountered something like that, because all of the firms that I have dealt with have been, and this was a major firm. And when I was angry, because I'm like, look, you just say no, right? If you don't, even if I am persistent, I can take rejection. I get it all the time. Every time I submit a journal article, I get a rejection. So just tell me no, you know, and say, sorry, we can't do it, we won't do it. Don't sabotage me. So I contacted the firm, you know, but they never responded. So, you know, and I told them as politely, you know, I had to write it a few times, but as politely as I could. But I will not go back to that firm. I don't care. That's a firm that I'll drop off the list, but I'll never go back to that firm and ask them for participants for anything. At least not, because this was in a New Jersey office, and so there are different offices. You know, I have friends who have colleagues that I work with who have different experiences with this firm, but this firm does have a pattern. It does have a pattern. So I tend not to try to access participants. So those are the kinds of things you have to be aware of. You know, I think for the most part firms have integrity and they won't do that because they value the relationship that they have with you. But this was not someone that I had a relationship with, so maybe that was a part of it too. But you know, you have to really look at your data too, because you know, it's not like you're getting data from, and a lot of times what firms do is they won't allow you to control it. Like you have to give them the instrument and they'll send it out to their people. You know, and so you don't know all the time. So that's the drawback. Firms are getting better about working with researchers, academic researchers. They're getting better. Like when I did my dissertation, as I said, my experiment was online. So they just logged onto a site and they completed the experiment. And they weren't even worried about IP addresses. So I had everyone's IP address. I didn't care, I didn't use it, but I knew that there were different IP addresses, right? But now firms are a lot more concerned about that. Why do you think that is? So most firms won't allow you to use electronic surveys. What do you think?
You figure out which firm it was, which
right.
people.
Right, they don't think we will, right? They don't think we will, the researcher will go back and try to figure it out, because actually, I don't want to know who did it, and I signed an IRB that says where I sign off that I don't know who's completing the experiment. But they're concerned that a regulator could come back and ask to see our results, and they could look at our data and then be able to trace responses back to the firms. That's what their concern is. But now, on Qualtrics, you could block IP addresses, and the firms have all kinds of techniques where they could block their IP address. So they're getting better at it. I know some firms are getting starting to be more willing to allow you to conduct electronic, because some, especially if you're doing AIS research, really, what's the point? You can't do an AIS research if you're not using technology, right? So I think they recognize that, and they're trying to be a little bit more open about those types of things. So that's the point. The challenge, the longest time that I spend is just trying to recruit participants. And then once you get them, get them to do it. And also just going through. I mean, I spent a lot of time on my instrument. I have several experimental projects that I'm working on now in audit with different colleagues at different universities. And one, we're actually not going to use auditors. We're going to use the general public. But we started this project in the summer. We were at the KPMG symposium, and they were presenting something, and three of us on the project, we were like, that might have some implications for assurance. And so we brainstormed it, got back, home, and we brainstormed some more. We are still working on this instrument, and we have weekly meetings, so we're making progress, but it's just getting the instrument right, asking the right amount of questions, trying to rule out, because you want to think of the appropriate control variables, make sure you collect the data. So you really have to be grounded in the research before you even develop your instrument, or at least finalize your instrument, because you want to know, you could be asking a question, you want to be able to rule out any confounds, and so that's why it's important to have the right amount of, so you do ask the standard demographic questions, but depending on the issue or the research question, there might be some site-based variables that you want to capture as well. So so that's a long time to spend on the instrument. We hopefully will be able to run this experiment in like another 2 or 3 weeks. We'll have it finalized, and we're not even using auditors. So if we were using auditors, we wouldn't even run the experiment until next year sometime. So those are the big. I like it because I like getting. And part of it too, I have to admit, is my audit background. That's what drove me to do experimental research, because my questions were always centered around auditors, or my interests. And at one point when I thought about going back to school to get my PhD, I thought about going back and getting my PhD in psychology. And then I saw how much money they made. I'm gonna be honest with you. Coming from corporate America, especially at the level that I was, to give up my salary anyway to go back to school was a big challenge for me. But then to say, okay, I'm gonna still be, and then just how long? They just seemed to be in school longer. And I did not want to be in school that long, so this was a good way to, and there was no reason that I wanted to be in psych. I just like the mind. Like I like to think, I like to get into how people think and how they make decisions and what drives behavior. So that's what my interest was, more so than, psych just seemed to be, oh, I could do psych, and then, oh, can't do that. So what else? So that's my intro. So what else about experimental? So there's also financial. A friend of mine at University of Illinois, he does behavioral financial, which is easier. And I'm not saying easier in terms of participants, right? Because a lot of the financial questions, you're interested in how users of the financial statements interpret information, how they make decisions. And so you can use MBA students, you can use, as long as the task is appropriate, you could go on MTurk now is a big way. Like I have a paper that's in, we actually have 2 papers from this series, but data we collected. One is in auditing, and we were looking at CSR information. So long story short, our interest was whether or not investors take a stakeholder versus a stockholder view. You guys familiar with that terminology, stakeholder versus stockholder? Yes. Okay. So we were interested in that and how that would, and so we had looked at theory and a lot of work that had been done on CSR and how users use that information was based on archival research. So so there were some competing theories that people were more interested in stockholder view, and so therefore they would potentially penalize a company that invested in CSR if they disclosed that, versus those people who had stakeholder view would reward them. So we looked at that, and so we used Qualtrics. We paid for a panel from Qualtrics for that, and then we have another study that's under revising. We're on second round at JBE from that same data, but looking at the fairness heuristic. Are people's decision, especially as it relates to CSR, driven by whether or not they believe it's fair and just? So which really expands on it, because what we were finding is that the people, at least the people in our experiment, took more of a stakeholder view. So then the second paper just explores what it is about it that leads to that. So that's what I say. So when you look at the impact of financial reporting on user decisions, then you're not necessarily going after auditors, which are clearly the more difficult subject pool, but you can use, because you're interested in investors. The study that I'm talking about that my co-authors and I are still working on the instrument is a jury study, right? So we're using people, which that's not that it's easy, but in terms of soliciting, we can go to MTurk because those are the people who would be, on a jury. You and I won't be on a jury, right? Because dealing with financial matters, because we're studying accounting, or we're accounting PhDs. They're going to disqualify you. As a CPA, I won't be on a jury for any financial, case, because they disqualify you based on the fact that you know something, right? You might have a certain bias, I guess. So that's one of the things that I say to students who are interested in doing experimental research. Is great, but you kind of have to diversify your work, and so you don't want to just stay in the wheelhouse of looking at auditors because of the difficulty. But there's so many more interesting questions that exist that you can ask related to users of financial statements, and especially as we move into data analytics, right? The use of data analytics, which a lot of that will involve auditors, but it's something that I think, as I said earlier, firms are interested in. Like, they're interested in how their people, how decisions are going to be impacted. Does it change, how people evaluate information? Will they use it? Like, one of the papers, and this is not necessarily using data analytics, but using technology that I signed, was the paper, Danielle Lombardi, some of you might know her, but she was Michelosa's student. I think Danielle's been out now for about 3 years. She's at Villanova. And what she did was take something that we observed in the audit literature about how auditors make decisions when they have both relevant and irrelevant information. And you read the paper, but the long story short is that they incorporate, less experienced auditors incorporate the irrelevant information even though they know it's irrelevant, and that's what they call a dilution effect. So Danielle's idea was like, well, what if they had an expert system? Would an expert system help to dilute or mitigate this dilution effect? And you read the paper, so you know that it did. But that's a way of being able, and she was able to get, subjects using her personal contacts to participate. She got a nice number of people to participate. And so that's a way of looking at how we have common audit judgment problems that the research is like, we know it's happening. We can speculate about why it's happening, but Danielle's approach was more proactive. Well, is there a way we could address this and mitigate it? And using technology, and she, with the assistance of a company, developed this expert system. So I think with experimental research, it's just really important because judgment is a big part of it. Even with all of this, with data analytics and all of the technology, judgment and auditing will never, ever, ever go away. And so there's always going to be a need to understand how auditors can make better judgment with more or less information. And what what factors impact that judgment. But even so, with people, with users of the financial statements, so, you know, you have situations where now we're talking about data analytics. And so auditors are basically saying, audit firms are basically saying, we can audit more efficiently and effectively because essentially we can look at 100% of the population, right? We can test 100% of the population. Well, what does that mean to the average investor who utilizes audit reports? If they think that the auditor, does that change? That's the project that we're working on. That's taking forever, right? Does that change how they view the audit report? Do they now hold the auditor to a higher expectation? Because there's tons of research that demonstrate that there's an expectations gap, that people believe that what the auditors deliver is very different from what they actually do deliver, right? So they expect auditors to find fraud, right? They know that they don't look at 100% of the items, but if their fraud happened, you should have caught it. But that's not the way the audit is set up, right? It's a financial statement audit, not a forensic audit. So, and fraud is very difficult to detect. Auditors are not good at it because they don't see it that often, possibly because they can't detect it. So, you know, but now, will the use of data analytics really create a wider expectation gap? And so that's just something that we're looking at. So there's a lot of interesting questions out there, and that's a question we're going to examine, not even using auditors. So, what else? I think, so why don't we discuss the papers, and then we could talk about the papers, and I can give you my take on it. Make sense? Sounds good? Okay. All right, so who's up first? Who's discussing? Let's start that way. I'm sorry, what you mean?
Neha.
And which paper are you discussing?
Investigation auditing decision process.
Okay, so we have two papers that are
Yeah, I have an audit mindset and audit of complex estimates.
Okay. All right, so that's a paper, that paper is one where this is a more recent issue, right? The audit of fair value. And as we all know the debate about IFRS and GAAP, but even if the US doesn't move to IFRS, which who knows, just the standards themselves are becoming more fair value oriented, which creates a huge judgment issue.